thanks for well the both invitations. You know, it's really I really enjoy reading Christopher's work, and I'm really enjoying to be able to be here to be talking about my own work. Actually, before we start, if you want to grab a flyer, these are the two books that just came out, and the one that's coming out. As mentioned, it's a funny thing. I've been somehow gradually going from writing about viruses. Can you hear? How's the acoustics here? Can you hear me? Okay? Yeah.
Kind of.
Kind of.
Yeah, it's kind of.
Just let me know if
I know them. It's kind of. They can't hear me.
Okay. I've been going from viruses to insects now, and I've been recently writing about zombies. So at least it sounds exciting. What I've been also more recently doing is trying to write about, in a way, the methodological and theoretical basis on which the stuff on viruses and insects, and in general, a certain media archaeology of network culture and digital culture, in a way, the methodological basis from which it stems from. And as said, California University Press is publishing our book very soon, but this actually stems from something I've been doing now. I've been lucky enough to be on a sabbatical for a year now almost, so I'm hopefully finishing a new book that's called Media Archaeology and Digital Culture. And I know I need to get something else in my titles than media archaeology. That's definitely something I need to do after this book. But it's a spin-off of the earlier stuff. It's coming out from Polity next year, hopefully. And in a way, this is something I'm going to be talking through. Is one of the chapters where I basically want to talk about media archaeology, especially in the context of artistic practices. It's only an overview. It's not going into really in-depth about everything having to do with this field. But I want to articulate a couple of key themes that in a way stem from media archaeological art practices, okay? And in a way what they can, give both theory and perhaps both into practical thinking about digital culture, and in a way themes like temporality, memory, and so forth. So more or less, I'm going to do, quite a traditional talk. If you want, you can always intervene me and ask questions, but more or less my talk is going to be probably that usual 45 minutes or so, after which we have time for questions. So please, because this is work in progress, I'm very much, eager to also hear your feedback, in a way, your perspective on some themes addressed here. So yes, as said, I'm going to be talking about practice in media archaeology, and subtitle being Creative Methodologies for Remediation and Creation. And I don't actually usually do PowerPoints anymore, but I thought in the kind of spirit of archaeology of overhead projectors to go into this medium as well. That's why I've got actually a lot of text, which is not good, but still, there's a couple of quotes. And I want to start with a quote actually as well. I did very recently an interview with Zoe Beloff, and where she revisits the idea of a time machine. Beloff, at the forefront of what might be called media archaeological art, does not only think of her own work that occupies itself with past media in the current high-tech cultures of media apparatuses as time machines that would transport us back to media history, but that media historical apparatuses do the time machine part themselves as well. So in Beloff's words, I want to foreground the 19th century idea that machines of mechanical reproduction are really time machines. Cinema, a time machine of movement, frame by frame awakening forgotten fantasies, stereophotography bringing about the artificial reconstruction of space, and the phonograph resurrecting the voices of the dead. So as such, technical media, and in a way Beloff's idea is backed by a huge amount of theoretical research that ranges from Friedrich Kittler to Tom Gunning. Basically, it articulated anew the questions of life and death, and even basic Aristotelian ontological premises of, well, you can't exist in two places at one time. But telephones, phonographs, and such mediatic splitting of people, voices, presence, actually did multiply our existence and sense of spatialities in a way that created the possibilities for the later economic fabs in digital economy, like, well, mediatic communities online. The reason why I want to start with Zoe Beloff has other reasons too. As briefly flagged, she stands at the forefront of media archaeological art practices, a parallel line of practice-based work that engages in similar themes as the written media archaeologies do. Basically, excavating lost histories of media, forgotten paths, resurrecting alternatives, as well as summoning surprising, one could say, non-linear histories of media, and times peculiar ways to understand both the existence of past media and new media, but also to find the new in the old, to paraphrase Siegfried Zielinski's words, and also addressing what interests me as well in this context are the regimes of memory in the age of technical media, which is of course a huge practical thing for every cultural institution that is interested in digital born content. How do you preserve stuff that, as a recent book by Norwegian scholar Eivind Rossak in a way puts it, how the move from archives of motion, for example 19th century, that, you know, archiving motion from science to other stuff, to archives in motion, i.e. the fact that our archives are increasingly working in software networked environments. Completely different kind of, well, that's the claim at least, completely different kind of a regime of memory. Okay. What interests me in media archaeological art practices is, besides this historical temporal theme, is how it engages with the material. Or, as Paul de Marinis puts it in an interview, Paul de Marinis is one of the key figures in this field. He says, this is the work that becomes or happens before words come in. He's writing his own software. He's doing his own chemistry. He's doing his own electronics. In Erkki Huhtamo's words, de Marinis is a thinker. Not only a tinkerer, not only a thinker, but a thinker. He thinks through creating assemblage works, and it works from what Huhtamo brands as technologia povera. To quote Huhtamo, using anything at hand, from second-hand electronic components, old record players, radios, and electric guitars to data gloves. I've got a short clip of de Marinis' work just to give you kind of insight into terms of kind of installation environments in which you know his finds. This is from his work Rome to Tripoli from a couple of years back. The sound's not that important, so that's why we're not plugged in. Where basically de Marinis reconstructed a 1908 radio apparatus. I think it was called Majorana, and you know, down to the smallest technical detail, in order to illustrate, in a way, the technical scientific culture supporting the colonialist enterprises of, you know, transporting cultural content from the old continent, Europe, to Africa and so forth. Tunes from classical music and so forth, you know, the normal radio content, but wanting to illustrate through this kind of a reassembling, recreating that scientific technical media layer through which it works. It's only a couple of minutes clip. I'll show you briefly. Okay. So, what we're dealing with are obsolete materials, past mediatic components, all of which are given an afterlife. And obsolescence is revealed to be only a halfway station in a wider circulation of technological elements. As such, thinkering refers to materials, to materialities, in terms of what is used, what is at hand, to the fact that one can always execute media archaeological excavations of the past through such works, instead of only writing about them. The earlier mentioned idea about what becomes before words kick in, we could always, of course, easily criticize this idea of non-worded romantics, of what comes before words, before discourse, before culture, would some add. And to many that way would be assuming a non-ideological stance towards media. But I'm more interested in something that I just slightly tongue-in-cheek call method of idiocy, which basically follows first, tracks things first, and only afterwards asks what the problems are and was it worth it. In other words, where can these projects and thinking about materialism through these projects, where can they lead us? As we addressed with Garnet Hertz in our recent discussion in C theory, there's also a strong need for strong articulation. There's a need for strong articulation of media archaeology, not only as a textual method, but also as a practice-based method, which doesn't mean that it hasn't happened already. The Marinis has been active since early 1970s, and since early 1990s, there's been a wide range of works that can be branded as media archaeological art, or having to do with art practices that are, in a way, media archaeological. But it's about articulation of these themes in order for them to, in a way, reach a certain sustainability or consolidate some of the ideas. As exercised by de Marinis and others already for a longer period as said, these methods are at times even more effective in bringing forth a multi-temporal and layered mode of executing past media as alive in contemporary current culture as well. This is what all the approaches share in different ways, from narrative content to material assemblages. The notion of practical execution of the ideas was articulated as one of the characteristics of this kind of way of doing media history that is not only historical in the kind of a historian's way of seeing it. My background is originally cultural history, but I've been always, more or less the bastard in the departments, doing something slightly, going on a tangent in terms of research interests, which usually, to me at least, more interesting. Indeed, as shown by Inke Arns in her text on some recent Eastern European artistic projects of media archaeological spirit, these projects are not about offering the stability of history only as a story leading inevitably to the current, but as one seeking of potentials. Things, ideas, relations that were never actualized per se. She refers to Dieter Daniels, a German media theorist, talking about, I quote, unredeemed technical utopias of the historical avant-garde that are now basically activated when we imagine futures of media cultures as well. This differs from a nostalgia, insists Arns, in that it refers to such pasts that never came to be, and as such are still, in a way, dynamic potentials, forces of the new. So, just like with media archaeology as a field, there has been, this is slightly, exaggerating that there has been lack of discussion. There has been lack of, sustained discussion in terms of art practices and theories and critical potential. I'm not saying that there hasn't been a huge amount of individuals already doing this. I'm just pointing towards the kind of need for sustainable platform for this kind of discussion. In a way, this is what we try to offer in the very soon forthcoming media archaeology book, that offers a variety of empirical but also theoretical examples of how to tackle with this concept. That to me, again, is not only about projects that use the specific term of media archaeology, but some of the ideas that are very relevant to think about new media, past media in parallel lines and in non-linear ways. So practitioners such as Paul de Marinis, Bernie Lubell, Zoe Beloff, Catherine Richards, David Link, and a range of others have been for a longer time identified as media archaeological artists. Similarly, recent years of media arts has seen a younger generation of practitioners bring in a new set of ideas and agendas, partly also because the influence of earlier wave of theories and art filtered through institutions and texts. So, younger generation, from Rosa Menkman and Garnet Hurst to Shintaro Miyazaki and Morten Ries, are just some names of this emerging younger generation of practitioners who are adapting ideas from media archaeological theories of Siegfried Zielinski, Erkki Huhtamo, and so forth. Including, of course, also Wolfgang Ernst as somebody specifically using the term of media archaeology in theoretical writings. Similarly, practitioners such as London-based Sarah Anglis and Alexander Kolkowski, both working with sound technologies, can be seen engaging with media archaeological themes in their work on cultures of recording, sound, and technology, even if they're not perhaps using the term media archaeology per se. Yet, what media archaeological art exactly means is often less articulated. We know it deals with engaging with the past, learning from the past media cultures in order to understand present mediated globalized network cultures, but what's the more specific thing that we need to carve out from these projects in order to kind of think about the methods of art from that point of view? In a way, as a form of brainstorming, I try to come up at least 6 different ways in which we can see old media, technology, and themes resurrected in the contemporary context, whether these happened in galleries, festivals, or online. Of course, I'm going to run through a couple of projects without going in depth. After that, I'm going to be talking about temporality, and after that, I'm going to be talking about nature, and why nature is really important when we're thinking about obsolete media as well, which is one of my, something I'm really interested in recently, nature, waste, and so forth. Which again is slightly something that hasn't been happening in media archaeology per se, but I think is a crucial political theme. So, firstly, artistic work that represent historical themes as part of work. For example, in cinematic pieces, there would be several, but one example could be Lynn Hirschman's Conceiving Ada from 1997, which reimagines folds of time between digital culture and this past heroine of early computers and software, Lady Ada Lovelace. Also, in the wider popular culture, you can find media archaeological themes in such products as the popular online clip, Pixels by Patrick John, and on one more production, where basically in this 10-minute clip or so, 8 big characters invade New York. It seems all to go under the theme of retro. Of course, retro can be seen as part of the wider nostalgia-driven consumer cultures, but hopefully there's also something more in this kind of a turn towards retro. Secondly, one key theme could be invoking alternative histories, which are able to offer critical insights into the assumed natural state of digitality, whether technological or social, through the art piece that goes against the grain in terms of materials it uses or the narratives of use and reality of media. Good examples could include, again, Zoe Beloff's cinematic reconstructions of gendered histories of technology, of mediums and devices of control, Paul de Marinis's the messenger installation, investigating telecommunications from an alternative perspective, various steampunk-themed ideas, of course, performances and devices kicked off by Gibson and Sterling's The Difference Engine novel as a fantasy of the information age already starting in 19th century. And of course, for example, was it last year or the year before, Transmediales, Gebhard Sengmüller's work, A Parallel Image, if you happen to see that, is a brilliant example of reconstructing alternative histories of media in terms of image transmission. Thirdly, art of or from obsolescence. Pieces and practices that engage with obsolescent materials and solutions in order to engage with emerging media cultures. Examples could be various. Wood cottages as key art that refers directly to media archaeological investigations into remediation of textuality, marginalized technologies, and useless media solutions. And of course, pointing towards already tomorrow's theme, the festivals such as Art of the Overhead projector series here, organized by Linda Hilfling and Christopher Gansing on obsolete image media, 8-bit sound cultures as inspiration for thinking about new digital culture and its artistic practices, as well as the more recent but still more or less outdated, at least technologically, as with Alexei Shulgin's live rock performances with a 386DX processor, computer and Windows 3.1 operating system. This happened in 98, but still it was already then obsolete. Or even the use of old materials, such as wood, to address high technology, as with Bernie Lubell's peculiar installation works across the years is a case in point. Something that's related, this is by the way from Sengmüller's Parallel Image from Transmediale 2009. Related to obsolescence, imaginary media that is constructed and not just imagined. Devices that are dead or never built being reconstructed and re-employed, whether out of curiosity value or curiosity value that investigate the nature of progress, change and technological culture as one enthusiastic about novelty, but also embedded in planned obsolescence. Also, the Marinis's works again, such as the Edison effect and grey matter, modulate already existing ideas in sound recording and electrical communications into inventive directions, into new concrete assemblages. Of course, Bruce Sterling's influential dead media project and such artistic parts of it, like the online interactive Embrace the Decay work, can be seen dealing with these kind of themes of technological disappearance and remediation. Some work under this umbrella of obsolescence and planned obsolescence to, in a way, to carve out a more political function as well, as does Garnet Hertz, California-based artist, in his Dead Media project. I'm going to return to that taps into questions of ecology, information technology, and using past media histories as storehouses for invention for new designs. Fifth, media archaeological art that draws from the archive, as in the way that historians do as well. In other words, artistic practice that is informed by archival work and working with historical materials. This kind of work is well documented in books like Sven Spiker's art historical take in the Big Archive, and visible in the works of such contemporary artists like Gustav Deutsch, his film Ist pieces, the already mentioned Sarah Anglis, who's able to draw on her background work in the Science Museum in London, and through her sound and robotic performances develop themes from media history. In addition, for example, the work of German media artist and theorist David Lenk, addressing, for example, the Manchester Baby computer, or the small-scale experimental machine, more officially computer, which was the first stored program computer, and as part of that also the peculiar love letter program by Gordon Strachey, love letter generator. All of that can be seen as, in a way, like a work of a historian, but a historian who doesn't express herself or himself in writings, but in constructions, history becoming media art. And 6, media archaeological art that digs not only into the past, but also inside the machine and addresses that side of conditions for our media culture. In a way that kind of just, I won't go into talking about Foucault and all the kind of definitions of archaeology that we adopt from Foucault, but it's so much of the work has been inspired the idea that cultural archaeology is about conditions of knowledge and conditions of what we can see and what we can hear. And of course we know that Foucault was adapted to a huge amount of cultural studies and cultural theory, but also history. And some of the really kind of interesting German media theoretical directions have, of course, been taking that idea into very concrete contemporary devices as well. Whereas Foucault was interested in conditions of knowledge that he found in archives, German media theory after Hitler has been interested in how these things, machines, are the conditions of knowledge and conditions for what we can see and what we can hear and so forth. So a very different kind of twist to thinking about media archaeology. And these kind of projects focus on opening up the machine as well as speaking to a range of important contemporary processes, protocols, software and hardware environments with art but also activist practices that at times come close to circuit bending and hardware hacking. Such projects include, for example, the Berlin-based Institute for Algorithmics and Micro Research Lab as well, Rosa Menkman's projects such as the Collapse of PAL, performed as part of Transmediale 2011 festival, and why not, for instance, Cory Archangel's interventions into game culture, such as hacking the Super Mario console game in Super Mario Clouds in 2002. This is a part I won't be talking about too much today, but it's one of the that interests me most, in a way, twisting media archaeology from traditional historical stuff into the different kind of a descent and genealogy. Okay, so what the various perspectives seem to suggest is focus on at least potentiality, that there's always more in the ways we design, use and mobilize our media technological gadgets, the assemblage nature of this kind of a tinkering, i.e. that our media, just like technology in general, is an assemblage of heterogeneous parts, and it's possible to pick apart those technologies, and at times we should be encouraging people to pick apart our technologies when we enter the realm of hardware hacking, circuit bending. And then also, as mentioned, we are introduced also with new senses, new understandings of time and temporality, which are not reducible to human-centered use value of time of media, but engage with non-linear, complex, percolated, or even ecological durations. So as said, I think the kind of, in terms of where I'm going to be continuing, are two things, in a way, picking up from this. Time or temporality, and then nature, and how the kind of ideas about temporality lead into nature. And think about nature, and all in the focus of art practices. So, okay, more or less, I would say that media archaeology has always been, and still is, in a danger of veering towards excavations of curious instruments and odd gadgets just for their own sake. Because, odd gadgets are fun, interesting, and why not? But the danger is that this kind of approach loses the kind of wider perspective having to do with politics of media culture, politics of design of media culture, and so forth, in which technology takes part in governing our bodies, affording perceptions, and building platforms for social relations, work, entertainment, and identity. All of these questions are, of course, what we know from cultural and media studies. And these are all the kind of questions that we have identified as the politics of everyday life, and we know the drill, okay? In a way, politics of media archaeology, if we try to find that, it has tapped into issues having to do with gender, like with Zoe Beloff's work, absolutely fantastic in a way, kind of a genealogies of the feminine as the excluded feminine of media cultures and technology. Okay, the aesthetico-scientific basis of technopolitics, as with Demarinis. Okay, ideologies of technological progress, again by a wide range of different artists, as well as environmental issues. For example, the recent work by Garnet Hertz. Furthermore, I'm really interested in how these kind of reconstructions and thinkering can mobilize new forms of temporality that act as subtle ways to rethink myths of progress, linearity of time, and teleological assumptions concerning evolution of media culture, which underpin the more mainstream ways of seeing how media technology is part of our lives. In terms of media archaeological art, lots of the ideas, various ideas, seem to be about, to put it in a way quite sounds simple, they're about mixing historical timescales intentionally. Tom Jennings' Storyteller, something that's again not at any way part of any media archaeological canon of art. Tom Jennings' Storyteller is a good example to illustrate the idea of media archaeological art as an assemblage, assembled of different parts, a curious time machine, again, that doesn't always transport us back or forth in time, but actually involves multiple temporalities in itself. The Storyteller is basically installation piece. Again, this is very sketchy introduction, so excuse on behalf of Mr. Jennings and so forth that I'm not going to be paying that much attention, but I'm using it to kind of illustrate a couple of ideas. Okay, it's basically a piece of reusing ideas and obsolete material from media history, including a teletype machine, a paper tape reader, and a phoneme speech processing system. While this installation performance piece, which includes also reciting 8 hours of narrative about Alan Turing, the Alan Turing of computer history, it can be seen to touch on the history of computing, of course, and Turing's idea concerning the infinite paper-based calculation machine, but also it involves a more complex mix of media, in the plural, of course. Not only computing, but referring back to telegrams, punched paper, to old storage forms, as well as the mechanical basis of computing. Itself is a multiple layer of different technologies, and with that, of different timescales. It fits in with the notion of history that in historians, the historian Fernand Braudel has talked about in terms of a polyphonic, symphonic history of various layers, rhythms, times that act in concert. But it's also something that is aptly described by Garnet Hertz as speculative conglomeration. Speculative conglomeration. This is a really long quote, apologies, huge amount of text. But basically, I think Garnet is able to articulate it quite well, the point here. And it's thanks to Garnet, this example as well. Basically, I won't read this too, because it's already there, but just to paraphrase, blend of dead media from the past, that's not only a replica of exact time and location, but a speculative conglomeration of lost forms of communication from history of computing. Function of paper tape and type. Also historical materials, important, bakelite, mica, and brass, and building of handcrafted enclosures from oak. Together, Storyteller is a hybrid blend of obsolescence, where unfamiliar time periods are layered into a functional system that is almost impossible to differentiate from an actual historical artifact from the 1950s unless you start picking it apart. And that's the important bit. Basically, we could say that Storyteller illustrates how technology usually isn't only old or new, but it's always assembled together of various pieces, and this applies not only to specifically experimental pieces in gallery settings, what we call art, but everyday media as well. This presents a different kind of a temporality that I see both characteristic of a lot of media archaeological art, but it's also illustrated from a philosophical side by the French philosopher Michel Serres, when he talks about, again, apologies for the quote, I mean that there's so many quotes. Basically what Michel Serres wants to emphasize is, again, him per se has nothing to do with media archaeology, but his philosophy of time and technology is important here. We need to be equipped to understand a complex, a percolated vision of time that doesn't just flow in one direction. Serres talks of foldable diversity as another characteristic of this non-linear way of understanding temporality and technology. And what is distinctive of even technology, such basic technologies as cars, that are only contemporary as an aggregation of various temporally disparate scientific and technological ideas. Basically, there's another quote, but where he kind of explains this, you know, if you think about a car, it's not really new. Some of the components, some of the kind of scientific ideas stem from 19th century. Some of the computer stuff, electronics and so forth is very new, of course. But then again, if you think about other components in a car, like the wheel, it goes back to Neolithic times. It's been, and then Serres continues of how, you know, the newness of cars, for example, or any kind of similar technology, is often contemporary by only the kind of assemblage work, by the design perhaps, by the finish, but perhaps only by the advertising, you know, rhetorics. Basically, we imagine our technological cultures as modern, or contemporary, even futuristic or progressive. But actually this is much more complicated, where Serres gives important philosophical insights which in a way could feed into why we think about this kind of media archaeological artworks also as illustrating a really important point about temporality. And this is the quote. Basically emphasizing how these themes of, you know, something archaic, something modern, and something futuristic are simultaneous. Then he refers to himself to the example of a car, can be dated from several eras, and every historical era is also multitemporal, always drawing from obsolete, then contemporary, and the futuristic. An object, a circumstance, is thus polychromic, multitemporal, and reveals a time that is gathered together with multiple pleats or folds, we could add. So I think what media archaeological art is good at doing at times is really forcing us to think about time as pleated, as folded. Outside the linear earlier, later time axle, it shows that time actually spreads in a variety of directions. Hence, many of the important discussions in society concerning machines and technology have to do with convincing what is new, what is obsolescent, and finding subtle ways to impose such categories through marketing, through legislation, laws, and political measures, for example. One of the most urgent debates since the 1990s has been, for example, about temporality of network cultures and the various attempts to capture internet time as a one specific form of speed. Speed of both, you know, the general discourse of progress, but also speed in terms of very mundane labor and work processes, and hence a different kind of materiality having to do with labor in digital culture. Again, I won't go into that, but it's just a offspring if we start thinking about it. Important is also how this leads us thinking about temporalities of nature. So I want to talk next about media archaeology as ecology, or its relation to a kind of certain media ecological way of thinking. So these kind of what we could call deep time relations, in a way to riff off Siegfried Zielinski, have a further meaning when considered in the context of ecology, and where media archaeology can turn into a much more ecological agenda, both in the way we use the term in popular discourse, but also in the manner that French philosopher Félix Guattari talked about ecology and relations between various ecologies of the actual nature ecology, but also ecology of psyche, ecologies of the social, and ecologies, I might add, of media or the mediatic, all in a way, again, in a way simultaneous and feeding into each other. Such an understanding of ecology is able to focus less on the traditional idea of balance that we found in classical ecological theories, and more on the topological connections between the various different regimes. One of the best articulations recently of this kind of a link between electronic culture and ecology is found in Jennifer Gabris's just published Digital Rubbish: A Natural History of Electronics, that mobilizes basically Walter Benjamin's idea or concept of natural history of commodities into current electronic culture. Here, obsolescence and discarded old media technologies and gadgets and electronics are revealed as one of the biggest threats to the environment and the wider material economy of electronic media culture, as a further layer in terms of how we should understand time. Of course, well, she doesn't come up with the idea, we know that, and it's part of, it's a huge policy issue on EU level and so forth, e-waste, but still, how to bring that in conjunction with our kind of a set of concepts that we adopt from cultural and media theory and media archaeology and art practices. Instead of times of progress, development, increasing machine speeds or use values, what Gabris does is present a different set of temporalities to talk about digital culture. Not digital culture of speeds, progress and so forth, but a digital culture that is more or less, or more accurately perhaps, branded by dust, as well as soil, and so forth. Another quote. Basically, where she basically articulates this as such. With the usual pronouncements on the progress, speed, abundance, and so forth, the dust is most often overlooked, and it's not a metaphor. We talk about real dust on discarded computers that are in your attics and so forth, or waiting in a recycling center for its recycling and so forth. But dust may in fact be more accurate gauge of these technological objects. For all the successive doubling of computing speed, and for all the flurry of new electronic innovations, there is a corresponding degree of electronic obsolescence. The dust, as such, is a marker of this time of obsolescence, and similarly to soil, as the ground in which toxins and heavy metals and so forth from abandoned electronics in landfills leak back to. This time is outside our use value. It's not the time of how we use media, how we interpret media, but it's stuff that happens after that. An argument we also put forth with Garnet Hurst in our joint text, Zombie Media, where we propose that this is still not dead media in the sense that Bruce Sterling talked about it, but zombie media, as in the living, the undead media. Perhaps dead to us in terms of we're not using it anymore, but completely still present with us, either as e-waste material that's leaking into nature. By the way, Gabris' book has really weird, kind of interesting details. For example, the fact that Silicon Valley is one of the most toxic places in the world, based on kind of its soil and how much of the stuff that's been produced there and how it's been leaking to soil. Anyway, or then the other way of seeing zombie media as repurposing of discarded materials. Hertz taps into same themes in his way of extending media archaeological art practices towards circuit bending and these kind of DIY practices, which, to be sure, haven't been at the forefront of media archaeological art. So we really are also pushing from the idea of media archaeological art having to do with past media cultures towards thinking about obsolescence and discarded media as well. But if we start to look, we see, in a way, similar kind of grassroots spirit in earlier media cultural periods. For instance, the radio amateurs of 1910s and 1920s as hackers of sort that were tinkering and opening up machines in order to construct their own. A parallel, perhaps a minor history in media culture that runs parallel to the histories of established media industries and the very different role to which users and consumers were placed into. For Hertz, this project sets as part of his what he calls Dead Media Lab that engages with organizing workshops of circuit bending, for instance. But the Dead Media Lab is much more than a lab for repurposing information technology. He quotes the statistics on the hundreds of millions of still operational devices that are discarded in the US alone. It's also a social laboratory for such practices that engage both in thinking about future green information technologies as well as promoting community engagement in DIY methods that are inventive of everyday reuses and appropriations of the art methods of early 20th century avant-garde. Repurposing existing media and ready-mades actually become less about Duchamp and history of avant-garde that we recognize from art history classes, and more about community hacking center activities. I think the link to media archaeology becomes most clearly voiced in this part of Dead Media Lab call, where he talks about innovation through media history. And actually I don't have the quote here, so I'm going to read it. Basically what he says is that history of obsolete information technology is a fruitful ground for unearthing innovative projects that floundered due to a mismatch between technology and socio-economic contexts. Because social and economic variables continually shift through time, forgotten histories and archaeologies of media provide a wealth of useful ideas for contemporary development. In other words, the history of technological obsolescence is cheap R&D, cheap research and design, that offers fascinating seeds of development for those willing to dig through it. And this, he continues, this lab encourages study of obsolescence and reuse in media history as a foundation for understanding the dynamics of media change. So basically, what he's saying is that as cheap R&D, media archaeological ideas about memory, time, duration, and obsolescence are part of a wider artist-activist engagement. Less a textual method. Circuit bending and hardware hacking are related to think about media history in fresh ways that also engage with the important question of how we are able to reuse such devices that too easily and too quickly end up in waste sites. Hence, this kind of work, such as Hertz's, ties to the lineage of media archaeological artists, such as, for example, Paul de Marinis, who also has been interested in the wider environmental ideas concerning media or nature as a crucial affordance for media devices, but also such initiatives as, for instance, the Media Shed in the UK. Media Shed's key activity revolves around the call for free media that is outside the proprietary structures and hence open both legally but also open technically, of course. Media Shed's work has focused both on software and reusing waste and junk materials, such as, again, electronic devices, for community and artistic purposes. And they've also showed an interest to obsolescent forms of communication in their eco-media projects and in a way community days, where they have expanded the idea of communication outside our communication technologies or the usual checklist of communication to think about, for example, nature and natural processes as communication way before media industries came along. Communication that we can find in such techniques like shouting, spitting, smelling, to of course something that's slightly more familiar like pigeon communication. All found in natural bodies. In these kind of projects, we are moving further away from what has been usually the safe ground of media archaeological art. Even if redundancy, obsolescence, time and dead media connected both the directions of free media activists and media archaeologists, the latter have as in a way Douglas Kahn has been pointing towards or flagged, media archaeologists, they haven't been too eager to be too political. Yet, this is to me the link that, for example, Hertz is able to make, and it's of crucial value in expanding the media archaeological theory and art methods. So again, in addition to Media Shed, another clear link would be also the UK-based Redundant Technology Initiative that grounds all of its activity in technology they could acquire for nothing. As such, it has meant concrete spaces for free media tinkering, as well as projects that recircuit back the recent media history, even in the form of Mac hypercards, ASCII text, 28.8K faxes repurposed as part of an imaginary TV feedback system, and manifestos promoting low tech. I'm kind of conscious about time because I've been talking a while already, and I don't want to bore you too much. And that's why I'm kind of thinking whether I should actually stop here and we could continue with questions and answers. How are we doing in terms of time?
It's 4:05. I mean, if you want to finish your argument, please do.
Okay. I'll run through the kind of last section really briefly. You know, get the end, so to speak, if there's an end. So, in a way, by way of conclusion. Okay. I want to flag the fact, you know, media archaeological art and art practices are really good in terms of, you know, expanding outside, thinking about media, where we can find media, how we can do media, okay? Hugely important political practice, or politically important thing. And hence becoming a kind of philosophy of time as well. And as such, a philosophy of time having a huge, again, political impact in terms of thinking about such things as ecology. Okay, it has done really important work in questioning some of the frameworks through which we can filter and design new media. Instead of progress and speed, we have dust and obsolescence. Instead of the new, we have perhaps recurring set of ideas, and so forth. In that sense, media archaeology, perhaps, when it's digging inside the machine and trying to see the logics of machine as one key, in a way, catalyzer or relay in terms of variety of themes, I like to think about it as perhaps in a similar sense as transversal methodology, as we're going to be talking about tomorrow with Christopher Gansing's work of trying to come up with, you know, connections between art and activism, and also this kind of a tap into media history, which I find a really important theme. From a media archaeological point of view, one of the key things that's been also doing is or what's most interesting that I'm going to leave at the small mention here is expanding and thinking about archaeologies of signals and signal formats and other kind of a grey stuff of media cultures. Instead of a focus on devices, or even if at times lost devices or abandoned devices, we are seeing increasing amount of new also theoretical perspectives that tap into these kind of minor grey elements of media history. A lot of the elements that we have taken for granted or as specialist areas in media cultures and media history for scientists and engineers are now actually becoming a core part of how we do media theory and media arts. Okay, I'm thinking about protocols, I'm thinking about wireless technologies, I'm thinking about, for example, computer forensics and studies from Alex Galloway's to Adrian Mackenzie's to Matthew Kirschenbaum's, all of which in a way provide really fresh approaches to think about media history and its components. Same goes increasingly with the minor themes or components of media history in the hands of theorists and creative practitioners. Signals or signal formats, those are valves, tubes, antennas, telephone exchanges, semiconductors are revealed as much more than enabling technical parts. Besides being, you know, the stuff in which we could say that power and knowledge happens, all these kind of great technical parts, they are also methodologically really interesting. Valves, tubes, signal formats, etc. For example, valves and tubes, they are the true transmedia that were essential for innovations from telegraphy to television and computing. Antennae are often the neglected part of our wireless and transmission cultures. Telephone exchanges are similar switch in terms of how communication works, and so forth. A great project that I won't go into now is the ex-Mongrel group and the trio Harwood, Wright, Ecology, Tantalum Memorial that engages with these switches, concrete sense of telephone exchanges, and relations between minerals and old technologies and so forth. Or then, and this is going to be the in a way end bit more or less, take semiconductors. Something that doesn't sound or isn't really exciting in theoretical sense, so it's probably not even exciting in the first kind of artistic sense, but perhaps there might be more to it. Semiconductors, the elements that are essential to modern technical communication media in terms of their material qualities that enable mediation between, well, conducting and insulating the flow of electricity. One could see the emergence of modern mass media as one of experimenting, testing and producing such materials that are stable and hence mass producible in terms of the capacities for conduction and insulation of flows of energy. And again, points us back to the kind of centrality of physics for technical media cultures and media arts. Semiconductors can be incorporated into media archaeological practices in a manner, for example, as does, again, Paul de Marinis in his elaboration of materiality of media. Or, as he puts it in his own words in relation to his 4 foxhole radios installations, short quote here, it turns out that semiconductors, the central discovery on which our communication culture turns, and among the most exotic products of material science, are in fact everywhere to be found. I have made junction diodes from burnt out light bulbs, mesquite barbecue charcoal, rusty batteries and 18th century nails, variable and fixed capacitors from packs of chewing gum, Bibles and discarded AOL CDs, coils and variocouplers from votive candles, whiskey bottles and shot glasses. These diverse materials serve to make the pieces both playful and instructive. Then he goes on to talk about how they reveal that the manufactured material world is still part of a greater universe, unbeknownst to Bill Gates. Semiconductor physics is unaccountably breeding in hidden places. Because they actually function as radios, they may help us to feel at home in the world. At any given time and place, Frank Sinatra's voice can be heard in the radio waves. For the installations, I add other sounds in the ether with small low-powered transmitters, so that you may likely as hear Joseph Stalin or Spike Jones. In this quote, this is going to be the ending, the dialectics of the kind of tensions between communication physics, how we technically are dependent on certain ways of mobilization of science for our technical media, but still that is not restricted to specialist capacities, specialist skills of scientists and engineers, but also physics couples with content, the voices transmitted, the stuff that used to be for a long time, the stuff that media studies was made of, is well illustrated. It also brings forth the willingness to dig into grey areas of media history, as mentioned above, to look at what connects and characterizes not only one specific medium, but to offer through constructions, innovative interventions, ways to understand media history non-linearly. The relations between media across times are much more multiple than often perceived, and this is already something that puts the whole category of the new into question. The new becomes transversalized, downgraded, rethought, open to hands and amateurs even, and hopefully perhaps leading into new ways of approaching technology and media as something we can do instead of only having and consuming. I know it sounds slightly idealistic, but the punchline being that the physics that is in a way governing our technical media becomes also political. I'm going to finish here now, really. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Great comments. Questions?
happy to elaborate on any of the kind of questions or comments or objections as well in terms of what you have and where it might fit in as well.
Should I start by just one of the things? I mean, there's many things you brought up here, but in the end, when you started to talk about things like semiconductors and valves and tubes, and saying that these more material things are becoming more and more important and crucial within media theory, and so on. And you quote people like Galloway and Mackenzie. I'm just curious. What is media theory, the field for you in that sense? Because you could argue that what you're talking about is, for a very huge part of the field, is totally unknown or totally outside still.
Yeah, no, it's a good question as well. Of course, it's not like it's talking about medium theory in cells. I've been mostly interested in some of the developments of the past kind of a couple of decades that have to do with rethinking some of the kind of how to put this in a kind of polite way. The stuff that came after cyberculture and other stuff having to do with the information culture of the 1990s discourse, and especially the kind of theoretical kind of that side of discourse, and in a way that tried to offer a focus, instead of this kind of really slightly vague notions, a focus into machines and such kind of concrete places or practices in which power and knowledge and this stuff that we used to call in 1990s cyberculture and information culture and stuff like that, where it actually happens. So it's definitely, of course, it's not as such people might connect it to strands coming from German media theory and the huge effect that Friedrich Hitler's work had since 1990s in American media theory, and as such offer the kind of material version of how they see media as an agent in history. I know that there's a huge amount of kind of a resistance towards that, and which is good and should be as well, but it kind of offered a certain thing that's been recently referred to as the Kittler effect by Jeffrey Winthrop Young, which means that after that kind of word came in, especially in these kind of certain kind of theoretical discussions, you really had to take some kind of stance towards Kittler's work in terms of which has provided fruitful thought. What's interesting in terms of German media theory to me is how much of it has been rhetorically based as a really strong differentiation from British cultural studies, media sociology, and for example Marxist research and especially Anglo-American research that was quite often branded into as one lump thing. I'm also exaggerating, but so were some of the rhetorical stances already then, and that has been in a way the kind of funny theme of German media theory doesn't exist because there's no such thing as unified German media theory, but it's been it's again Jeffrey Winthrop Young has been put it nicely, it's become such a kind of brand export article like Volkswagen and so forth for this time for theory circles. What's interesting is that in the aftermath, I think partly because these ideas have been slowly, bubbling under and being integrated in the curricula, for example, Anglo-American universities, huge amount of more recent media studies directions, especially in the US, platform studies, software studies, computer forensics, and so forth, they actually are very close in spirit to what used to be called German media theory, that we now can read in the works of still, of course, Kittler, but also Wolfgang Ernst and so forth. So in terms of kind of there's interesting to think about this in terms of international disciplines, or kind of a international, in a way, relations between disciplines and this kind of debates and so forth. So it's pretty much, of course, that field, which had huge effect to new media theory as well and media arts, but definitely, of course, not the whole story about it.
Because there still seems to be a fairly clear divide between, if you take traditional media journals published by Sage or Routledge, you would never find these references really. I mean, that would be some. So it's a great line going across the field.
True, and it's probably something that is embedded in so many other national cultures, having it media studies as well, within Germany as well, and within UK, US, Finland, so forth as well, and it's definitely that. I don't know how to come up with a good, really good summary about it, but it's completely true, of course. I agree. I need to think about that. In terms of stuff.
I won't say anything because I think many of these things we could discuss tomorrow.
Yeah, and
I
it's
have lots of questions.
yeah, it taps in similar questions as with Christopher's text as well. And to me, the whole question about the grounding of media theory in Europe is an interesting one. And whereas such stuff, a bit like in the wake of the huge influence that so-called French theory had in the US academia, and of course the other English-speaking countries and theory debates since 1970s or so, was followed up by as fake in a way invention of German media theory, and now we can talk about this next wave seems to be Italian theory, which lumps together various post-Fordist theories from Franco Bifo Berardi to Maurizio Lazzarato and so forth. And to me, I mean, I've been otherwise more interested in kind of picking apart, or kind of not picking apart, but actually looking at the kind of influence within Europe and within the theory discussions having to do with the various strands of work. A good example is that a couple of years back, one of the last projects I did in Finnish was with a couple of colleagues, and started off as we thought that we needed to do a book on German media theory, but it became less interesting than doing a book that actually ended up something we called continental media philosophy, which in a way tapped into this kind of triangulation of German media theory, French philosophy, and Italian post-Fordist thought. Something that's actually, funnily enough, was picked up by Alex Galloway just recently in New York when he was doing his lectures on contemporary French philosophy, i.e. the really recent stuff, from Stiegler to Meillassoux and so forth. And I think it was the first lecture where he kind of opened up with the idea that, in a way to modulate Marx's idea that he's kind of a Marxist, what the cliche almost that Marx is a kind of a synthesis of how did it go, socialist thought from France and political economy from Britain and so forth. We can think about contemporary Europe in terms of that we have media theory in Germany, and we have political philosophy, political thought that comes from Italy, and then we have philosophy that comes from France. And so of course it's slightly exaggeration, but it's I find it fascinating in terms of thinking about stuff that we can synthesize from and so forth. So the edge towards in a way philosophy is probably quite strong in terms of kind of theoretical discussion as well. But how to bring into that philosophical discussions the concrete mediatic contexts that I find the work quite often better in artistic practice, for example. That's the important bit that's quite often missing in various also media philosophy as well.
Okay, I can ask.
Yeah.
Which probably doesn't have too much into tomorrow's discussion. Have you looked into media archaeology outside of the Western context, and media archaeology, also art practices, and how would you see media archaeology outside this kind of canon of, also the thinkers of media archaeology like Zelinsky are really even if he's trying to go beyond it, he hasn't actually written about it. He's just always talking about that it should be westernized.
Yeah, I'm as bad. I completely agree that it should be, but I don't have the resources to do that, for example, myself, and I don't have enough knowledge about that. but it's an important project in which the kind of media archaeological spirit having to do with certain specialities, spatial understanding that is really at the core of the way in which we think about media history has to be also challenged and rewritten and so forth. As you said, Zielinski's Variantologies project has been trying to push towards that direction. It's an increasing amount of stuff that is coming out. It's really crucial for this as well. That is not branded by the notion of media archaeology, but is, to me, as again a parallel development, like Laura Marx's recent book on the history of media art through kind of an Islamic genealogy of media arts. It doesn't start from the usual suspects of how we think about media arts, or kind of a computer media arts or artificial life media arts, but starts from Islamic carpets and visual culture of Islamic carpets and so forth, or the visual patterns in general. So completely, again, I would use the term non-linear in the sense that it really taps into a completely, it really nudges your ways of thinking into a different mode of seeing these things. It's that kind of stuff is really important. Yeah, I've been, in terms of this, perhaps my interest has been towards pushing the kind of towards the non-human, so to speak, because of the ecological context, but also theoretical as well. So that's why I've been less interested in humans, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't be interested in humans, but we need to be interested in nature and insects as well.
When you talk about media archaeology, on the one hand you talked about it as an artistic practice, and on the other hand more as academic reflection, but you didn't really make a really big distinction between those two. Do you see that more or less as something really blurred?
Yeah, I think it could be blurred in at least a couple of ways. The first blurring comes from the fact that, a lot of the kind of canon of writers about media archaeology have been some people who've been very much embedded in the art institutions. Huchthammer works at UCLA, Design and Media Arts. Zielinski has been embedded in art institutions now at UDK, University of Arts in Berlin. And similarly, it's quite often in kind of you find resonance between theory works and artistic practice, kind of a really bubbly, kind of really working in an art institution. So it's kind of institutionally interesting as well. Theoretically, again, yes, it probably has to do with the institutional link, but also the fact that it was so much embedded in the 1990s emergence of media arts that this kind of stuff came about. So 1990s kind of a critical media arts as a kind of a critical rethinking through doing of emerging digital cultures was one key impulse. So you can really see that throughout the kind of works that are being done, whether written or whether executed in other modalities, and no, it's definitely intimate link, and I'm kind of unwilling to make too much of a distinguish those as well. There probably would be reasons as well to distinguish, but it's for strategic reasons that I don't want to do it now. Any more questions or comments or any kind of clarification needs and so forth?
One quick question is you mentioned I can't remember it's digital rubbish.
Yes.
Which is like you could say to some degree the end stations of things.
Yeah.
But are people interested in like where do these you talk about physics at the end, like where do things come from?
Yeah.
What are some of the conditions?
Yeah. No, I think.
Are people interested in that?
Yeah, I don't know whether, it's only for geeks, and crazy media theorists. I think the kind of important bit about that it's a good question because it points towards the fact what I've been interested in recently is the question of again nature. Okay. Something I didn't really articulate that clearly here is the fact, slightly to exaggerate, is that we've been slightly too much in the kind of earlier legacies, not anymore for a long time, but early legacies of media studies and so forth, interested in how we use media and what we do with media and so forth. Important questions, of course. But at the same time, again, stuff that happens after we stop using media is increasing to me something which is of absolute importance, of how they return to nature. When I say return to nature, it also implies that actually they come from nature, i.e. both in terms of understanding the fact that technical media anyway is about modulation of affordances that come from nature. Physics is based on modulation of nature and taking into kind of natural processes and standardizing those in order to kind of establish communication media, and also the really kind of very material and cultural practices where our televisions are being made, from what kind of materials and chemicals our televisions or other, again, let's say screen media at this time in general, are being made, filled with toxic chemicals, and who and how they've been outsourced, especially to certain kind of poor Asian countries, this kind of really absolutely cancerous work, literally cancerous work, which is kind of a crucial, again, for the fact that we can spend our time in front of plasma screens. This is something that Sean Cubitt, the film theorist, has been recently talking about, so I'm kind of riffing off again Sean Cubitt's work, but he's made some brilliant papers recently in terms of understanding that we need to turn our media histories, we need to turn our media theoretical understanding also towards these kind of questions of the wider networks in which how do media come about, what they do, and where do they go afterwards. That involves materialities having to do with, again, chemicals, etc., and it has to do with materialities work. Again, the kind of really funky, scary political economy having to do with of where we do our media, and why does it have to be that kind of poor bastard in a Chinese village that actually risks his or her life picking apart the chemicals and so forth, and yeah, and of course that kind of extends to other discussions. We had yesterday in Berlin, we're hosting Matteo Paschinelli's talk about energetics in media theory, and energetics in media theory and having to do with technical media is a kind of concrete topic as well. Again, for the fact that server farms are one of the biggest pollutants of CO2 as well in the world at the moment, even more so than airline industries. The whole economy, or whole ecology of the so-called information technologies that are immaterial are based on the fact of these, again, really funky links of where, how, and with what kind of environmental costs are Facebook servers or whatever servers being run in places. Of course, it's a huge business. For example, Finland is probably, I would imagine Sweden as well, is turning old Fordist spaces like paper mills and so forth. Now, after they due to bigger economic turns, after these kind of becoming obsolete, desolated places in rural Finland next to the rivers and abandoned paper mills, now being turned into post-Fordist, hubs of post-Fordist economy in terms of factories being turned into data servers for Google and so forth, where they're branding it through the fact that they can use renewable energy to cool off those data farms. But it's not, of course, as said, in terms of CO2, it's one of the biggest threats that we have. These things.
I asked actually because a year ago or so I read an article, I think in the New York Times, where they were writing about that some geologists, American geologists in Afghanistan, were surprised to find huge amount of stuff that is really important for computer chips.
Yeah.
And it was like, and it could help the Afghanistan country to kind of rise again and become this good economy. And
Yeah.
I don't tend to have conspiracy theories, but it's like, well, could that actually be a big reason for that?
Yeah.
The U.S. is there.
Yeah. No, it's a good example. The classic example is coltan, Columbine tantalite that you find especially in Congo, which has been, the funding for the Congo really, I don't know how many million dead in the Congo wars since the past some years and so forth. So you can really find through these kind of minerals and kind of materials, you can really, as you just said, track a huge amount of stuff having to do with, concrete material stuff and how they feed into information technologies, but also a wider set of political and economic agendas as well.
Yeah, and of course information technology is more and more important in warfare. So
Yeah, exactly. Both the object and both the kind of enabler of warfare. That is a good example, and that's exactly what I was kind of in a way after, in terms of the that's the stuff where information technology comes from, and that's stuff from in a way geology of information technology. Geology, both in the sense that stuff that has been stratified for millions of years, but geology also in the sense that Deleuze and Guattari talk about in that of geology in their book A Thousand Plateaus, in the chapter of geology of morals, where they kind of introduced a kind of a very crucial non-human ideas in terms of understanding ontology. I won't go into that, but it's again we can see this kind of double binds in various senses, from conceptual to very concrete.
Anything else? I don't see enough questions.
No. Well, I was thinking, I saw you talked where Donna Haraway was also talking the other week in Utrecht, and I was thinking how she talks about companion species, and it's mostly about animals, but I guess you could also talk about old TVs as companion species of circuit boards, or the people who provide us with the minerals in Eastern Congo.
Yeah, true. A whole ecology of relations that were, in a way, whether we want to emphasize kind of subjectification that we, again, key concept, the way in which we have understand subjectivity and subjectification, through object relations that psychoanalysis taught us, okay? But actually we can think about the various processes of introjection that has to do with also non-human objects, the fact that these things form a kind of really substantial part of our object relations as well, and hence these stratified go from the kind of human focus that, for example, psychoanalytic theories have had in terms of giving us a framework to understand subjectivity. Think about subjectivities co-forming in relation to, again, various concrete or at times abstract but still as material technological frameworks, and then how that leads into kind of a long networks to, again, use kind of notion from Bruno Latour, in which we are constellated by these workers endangering their kind of health because they're compiling our televisions somewhere as well. It's a nasty ecology of relations, of political economies, of mediatic ecologies, and of various complexities. And it's in that sense, it's as I talked in that talk, I mean, Haraway's concept of nature cultures was already kind of a nod towards, or kind of a really elaboration or grounding elaboration of these kind of topological continuities from nature to culture, which I want to extend towards media culture, not media cultures, but media or nature and media as well, and but at the same time we need to be aware of these really abstract, but that's real, political economic networks, for example. New materialism was the kind of a context of that talk, where I was giving a talk with Haraway, and there was really a range of really good talks. And new materialism was really, by the way, it's going to be next year's new materialism is going to be in Linköping, in Sweden. We started last year in Cambridge, and now it was in Utrecht, and now next year it's going to be in Linköping. And new materialism is a really interesting field in terms of thinking about perhaps that kind of stuff, really taking, again, going back from the so-called textual turn of thinking about representation, signification, and so forth, to going into think about various funky materialities that constitute our living worlds. I've been mostly interested in, scientific media materialities. At the same time, under the umbrella, we can put in various other kind of materialities, whether they're kind of having to do with art practices, as with, for example, Brian Masumi and Erin Manning doing in the Montreal Topological Media Lab, where they extend into kind of investigations into movement and so forth, and hence dance and other kind of performative embodiments. Or then the kind of what we use to recognize perhaps more easily from Marxian framework as well, of materialities having to do with labor and work, but which are increasingly as crucial part of the so-called immaterial labor process as well. So again, Tiziana Terranova's work is absolutely fantastic in this kind of double bind of understanding immaterial labor as a very concrete, time-consuming, energetic practice that wears people down, but does also other things. Yeah.
Okay. It's like Christopher hinted at, this is the kind of discussion we will be continuing with quite a lot tomorrow, I'm pretty sure, because these things always overlap to a great extent.
Yeah.
It will be fun to do that. Thank you very much for this part one of your two parts here.
Thanks very much. This was fun. Thank you very much.